On this episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast, I'm joined by Robin MacPherson. In this first episode of a two-part series, we get into the emotional and psychological aspects of traveling the world and learning languages.
Welcome to the Actual Fluency Podcast, the podcast that gives you the tools and inspiration to learn languages faster and more efficiently. And now your host, Chris Broholm.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. This week I have an amazingly special guest, and I'm very excited to announce that I'll be having Mr. Robin MacPherson on. Robin recently published a documentary on YouTube about his life, about finding home in a foreign country, and it was a very well received documentary. It was episode 1, he called it, about 20 minutes long. And I just knew when I saw that video, I just knew that I had to get him on because he shares so many deep emotional things in the documentary that I really wanted to drill down into. And indeed, it's very easy when you're doing these kind of interview style shows that you often focus a lot on the positive aspects, like, yay, learning a new language, learning new cultures, I'm meeting new people, I'm having fun, I'm becoming a better human, I'm becoming more social. We look at all these positive aspects, and what I think, I mean, you'll listen to the interview in just a second, but what I think we get into really well with Robin is that he's very realistic, and he really evaluates both sides equally, whereas a lot of people might not even consider that there are negative aspects to leaving your home country, moving abroad, learning a new language, all these things. And that's what we talk about today. So also, we had quite a long talk, Robin and I, and it was a very exciting talk and lots of good stuff. So that actually does mean that for the first time in the show's history, that this is going to be a two-part episode, because there was just too much stuff to fill in one episode. It would have been way over an hour if I had to put it into a single episode. So the first episode that you're going to hear now is the episode where we discuss this documentary, and we talk about the emotional and psychological responses to learning languages, but we don't get into as much specifics. We don't specifically talk about how he's learning it or this and that. It's more about life goals and happiness and loneliness and all these emotional and psychological aspects of it. So if you don't care too much for that side of the coin, I can only suggest that you listen to next week's episode, or indeed, if you're listening to this in the future, then check out the next episode. This is episode 9, and the next episode with Robin will be episode 10. And so if you're more of a practical person, then go listen to that next one. That's pretty much it. And always, as always, I should say, be sure, if you want to check out any show notes, if you want to check out Robin's excellent documentary before the episode, I suggest you pause and go to actualfluency.com/09, where the links and everything will be in the post below, so you can see who Robin is before you hear his wise words. And with that said, allow me to bring you this week's interview segment, which is with Robin MacPherson. All right, listeners, I have a very special guest on the show today. My guest on this episode is Robin MacPherson. Robin is 22 years old and originally from England, but moved to America when he was 16. Through living in a variety of places, he developed a hardcore passion for languages and cultures, and recently he premiered with his YouTube series called The Life of Rob, where he documents and discusses big life questions. Robin, so glad to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. I gave the listeners a little bit of an introduction, but they want to get to know you better. Can you tell me a little bit more about yourself and how you first found yourself learning foreign languages and cultures?
It's quite funny. Like some people, I've also heard I actually was terrible at foreign languages in school as a kid. My first encounter was French in primary school, and I just was terrible at it. I never, I don't know if this is just me recalling it this way, but I swear nobody ever actually told me that, foreign languages don't just translate word for word. So, what I would do is I would take, dictionaries and literally just translate every word.
Right.
So I'd end up with, like infinitives of verbs and, just all throughout sentences. And it was pretty bad. But yeah, and then I spent a lot of time in France and Spain with my father and as a kid. So that kind of got me interested in the sort of the other side of it in regards to the food, the music, and just general cultural things. And then when I was about 14, I just decided one day, completely out of the blue, Mom, I want to learn Spanish. Could you please, buy me one of those books, just any book, just so I can start learning Spanish? And that's what she did. So I started teaching myself Spanish on my own, just using these little books. But I never really knew that I liked it that much. I was just kind of enjoying it. But then when I moved to the States, where I was a lot of Latin Americans living in the town where I was. And so that was really what sort of started the love affair with foreign languages. But even then I didn't quite realize how much I loved it until I got into university and I started Japanese, and that was really when things sort of kicked off. And even the whole sort of multilingual side of me is really very new. I really only started that when I was in Japan. I picked up French again a little bit before I went to Japan, but it was really during my time in Japan that I just suddenly it just caught fire.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And we'll get back to Japan in a minute, of course. But first, I just wanted to ask you: do you remember if you had any? Did you use Teach Yourself or any of these highly known courses, or was it just literally a book in Spanish that you would just cross-reference with a dictionary? Or
it was really not. It was one of those sort of become fluent in 6 weeks, or not fluent, but business fluent in 6 weeks.
Right.
It was quite a delightful little book, actually. It was sort of a nice little narration. It was a lady, on a plane, as they are, she starts talking to a Spanish man and, et cetera. But it was I liked it, but at this time I had no clue any of the big name books. She could have brought home anything and I would have enjoyed it,
Right.
So.
Oh, that's great. And of course, the way I became aware of you was through your documentary, as I just alluded to in the introduction, where the first episode was recently released. And I mean, I must say, it's just incredibly well made. You have YouTube videos that are quite crap usually, and when you put out the link, I must say you're not the best at teasing, because you put out the link and you were like, guys, I'm speaking like 8 languages in this movie. Are my accents any good? And I thought, oh god, I'm going to listen to a grainy webcam video of some guy trying to speak 8 languages, and he probably only spent an hour on 5 of them. So I opened it up and I was like, holy, what is this? How did you? I mean, I guess the first interest for me is, do you have any kind of interest in filmmaking on the side, or did you get help for that side of it? Because it's really high quality.
Thanks so much. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for that, because that is a big compliment. Absolutely. And no, it's a bit of a complicated story, and I don't really want to go into the too much of the sort of the grimy details. But my love for video making actually came when I was recovering from a surgery, which I mentioned in the video, and it was sort of a very difficult time for me. Very, very, very difficult. And I watched a video online, and funnily enough, it was a French documentary. Although this is before I had any interest in French, I was still into Japanese. And yeah, it was such an inspirational documentary. I don't know. It changed. It's not always that it's the best book or the best documentary, but sometimes it's just exactly what you need at that time.
Right, yeah.
And it just changed everything for me. And so I started exploring on Vimeo. I just found all these, and I ended up with this, folders and folders of bookmark videos, to where I realized when I needed motivation to write a paper, for example, I had videos that would motivate me to do this. If I was sad, I had videos. So I really realized the potential that videos have to sort of plant seeds in people's minds, to sort of inspire people. And so that's why I just decided I want to do this. So I know I have zero formal training with video work. It was just over time. I took my student loans and I decided to invest in one little thing per semester. So the big one was the camera, of course. That was a kick in the gut for bank account. But yeah, and so over time I've just been studying film, how to essentially make, high quality video. And so this show has actually been in the planning for 4 years now. And
wow.
4 years ago, all it was supposed to be was a Japan blog, because I'd seen all these. So it's changed a lot, but I'm really excited with, and I'm glad I waited so long to publish it, because I did feel quite happy with the overall product. I think it was a bit long, and I've gotten some great feedback from people of how I could improve it. So I'm just really excited and I've got tons and tons of ideas for coming videos, so I'm really excited to get more stuff out there.
Yeah, excellent. And I guess I'll tell you that I think you did kind of a 2-part video, where the one was about your life in general and in your life in Japan, and then there was that intermezzo with you speaking the 8 languages, which was the first reason I got to the video. But I think if you had separated those two, I think you would have had a more powerful, a little bit shorter, like you say, video. And that, for me, that was the only thing I would change. I mean, I think it's really a brilliant piece. And I mean, you're obviously very interested in the philosophy and, the psychology of everyday life. I mean, you talk a lot about home. The trouble, I mean, that's the name of the episode. It's about finding home. And one thing I want to ask you about that is why is it so hard to find home in, I mean, I'm sure some people do it, but I've heard this before, that we live in a country, let's say I live in Denmark, for instance, and I don't quite feel at home because, I speak in English most of the time. That's not the native language of Denmark. I watch British television. I'm talking to American people. I'm eating Italian food. The culture is just a mishmash of everywhere. How do we? Why can't we find that home? Because obviously it's not a physical place. It is a place in your mind, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a good way to think about this is, for example, and you probably noticed in the video, especially the Japanese section, I love food. I'm very passionate about food.
Right.
And I don't just mean in the sense of eating it. I like. And so a great idea for me to think about a cuisine, for example. So I think the cuisine should be an extension of the people in that country. It should be an extension of everything that country stands for. It should, its history, the way that those flavors have been built up, and the way that the dishes have kind of developed and been created. And so, if you have a lot of places like the States, like and even England nowadays, although I'm very passionate about English cuisine, so don't bash it too much. But sometimes you end up with like in England, where you're eating most of, Indian food is the most popular food in Britain, and then you find yourself nowadays where fish and chips is what's apparently representing, Britain as far as, and in that sense too, it doesn't quite feel at home. Because you're not really embracing what that country has to offer. And I'm not sure that makes any sense, really. But
well, you said in your video that when you came back to Britain after, I think it was 2 years away or something, you felt like you were a foreigner in your own home.
Exactly.
How's that feeling for you?
It is very odd, and England, England's culture is very sort of explosive. It changes very quickly. The music market is a good example where I left one time, came back a couple of years later, and we had dubstep all of a sudden being created and several subgenres. So that was a part, but it was just because I left England with a certain image where I thought America was going to be, and it really was the sort of the grass is green on the other side. I really thought for many years, and that was just going to be a certain way, and it just wasn't that way. Especially because I really did think it was going to be sort of big, bright lights, huge buildings, and I ended up on one of the smallest towns in the mountains of North Carolina. The culture shock was incredible, and so I realized while I was there, a lot of the things that I loved about England, even though when I left England, I almost hated it. I was so obsessed with this idea of going to America. So I think, and as I spent time there, I didn't come back for 2 years. And so, people move on, when I came back, most of my friends, a lot of them, I just hadn't managed to keep in contact with too well. They'd moved on to new things. They're all in university all over the country. Once again, the music was different. Everything was just different. And I think mainly because I had left as one person and I'd come back as such a different person that I needed time to adjust. And that my initial reaction was almost like I felt like a foreigner in my own my own country. So it was bizarre. And I've heard that described by a lot of people as well that have spent time abroad and come back.
Right. Because they're thinking they're going, oh, I'm going home. I know what this is like. But obviously you're a changed person after 2 years. Or
Exactly. And that goes back to your question about, this whole home thing. It's that, when we say we're going home, once again, we do often associate it with sort of the general place, the general image of what it is, Denmark or England or the States. But I find that when you go home and you come back to the people, because that's what I said in the video, people are such a huge part of that idea. That I find that I do feel at home there. Like if I come back and I've got this lovely warm welcome of the people I grew up with or people I've spent time with, people I've loved and shared great memories of, then I feel truly at home then. Right. And then for me, of course, that's been a rarity because otherwise I wouldn't have made the video. But I have experienced it, and it's a great feeling. I don't know. Would you agree with that? Have you had the same experience? Or
yeah, well, I haven't. I only lived abroad for a year, and I was in England for a year, and
oh wow,
I don't. My problem was that I never really had a home. Really, when I was growing up, we moved a lot, our family, and I guess that if you live in the same place physically for a long time, you might also associate that mentally as home. But for me, I was just moving all the time, and to be honest, I didn't even consider where I lived home because it was just such a fleeting moment. It seemed like at any time I could just move, and I did. The London thing. I think I talked to a guy on a Monday, and he said, "Do you want to come and work for me in London?" And I said, it took me a week to decide, but then I was on the plane, day after.
Wow.
So that just shows you that I had no emotional attachments to what people would call home. And I struggle with the same thing now. What am I really, and where is home? It's the connection, isn't it? It's just not home. It's also where do you belong kind of thing. And
exactly.
I just don't know yet. I'm searching for it.
Yeah, and that's the reason why that's what my show is built to deal with. It's because once again, I think a lot of people, if not all of us, do deal with this sort of a question on some level. Even if you haven't really considered it. And so oftentimes if you actually ask somebody these questions, okay, what is home to you? It's very hard to answer. Right. So that's why my goal is to sort of, give like a sort of a first person present tense narrative of of my sort of journey to sort of answer these questions. So.
Right. And if we move on to your, continue with your show a little bit, the overarching theme for me is definitely the balance of happiness and maybe not depression, but definitely some dark element, maybe loneliness or, you're excluded in a sense.
Yeah.
And why do you think that, you have these great memories, you go to Japan and you have the great times of your life. And then it seems like it immediately follows that you go into this kind of, you isolate yourself and suddenly you're just not doing, as you were doing before. What do you think causes that huge change almost overnight, it seemed?
Yeah, it's quite difficult. Before I left for Japan, I treated Japan, my sort of study abroad experience, as almost like a research sort of experiment, because a lot of people were coming back from Japan with quite negative experiences. Now they had lots of great ones, but most of those tended to be with the foreigners. And this is an issue not just in Japan, but I think especially in Japan, they tended to have all these stories about how, you'll go into a store and they'll try to walk away from you. They'll only speak English to you, etc. Yeah. And that is something that a lot of people do experience. So I spent and after my surgery and I had another chance to go to Japan. That was after twice I was unable to go. I actually decided to wait a whole extra year because I had heard all these stories and I wanted to spend the time on not only just trying to become as fluent in the language as I could, but I wanted to sort of theorize, why are people having these issues, and how can I try to be different? And so when I ended up getting the interpreting job, all of a sudden, I feel like a lot of my theories were proven true, because I found that the ability, first of all, having the ability in the language is such a massive, massive thing. And it sounds obvious, but you would be, well, maybe not, but it's just surprising how many people go to places like Japan with very little knowledge of the place. And they're surprised when people don't, receive them all. But there's, and then also just having the knowledge of the much, much, much deeper cultural things, the historical aspects. And so it was great in Fukuoka. I went in working. And so everybody I met was Japanese and I was in a working environment. Right. In Fukuoka, there are a lot of foreigners there, but most of them are actually Chinese and Korean. So they're not as used to Westerners, quote unquote. And so I got treated really almost like a Japanese person, because as soon as I opened my mouth and spoke Japanese, They just wanted to talk to me, they were interested. And then after a couple of hours of that, it got past that. It got past the novelty of being a foreigner, and it became, now we're just friends. And it was just so great. But in Kyoto, I was studying abroad. And so all of a sudden I went from being in an environment where I was one of the only people really, it didn't even matter that I was a foreigner. I went to being in an environment where, first of all, Kyoto has millions and millions of Westerners everywhere anyway for tourism. And I was living right in the center of that. My university was across the street from the old Imperial Palace.
Right.
But also, not only that, you're now in a program surrounded by thousands of foreign students that are there. Right. And so that was a big part of it, because it was the environment, the Japanese people in Kyoto and my university were much less actually. It was very segregated in a way. It was in the dining hall, you would just see table upon table on table of sort of Japanese people, and then you would see the foreign tables. Right. And it was just much harder for me to sort of get myself in. And I was succeeding, but then I had these financial issues and stuff, and it became very difficult because a lot of the Japanese friends I had, they wanted to go out to these all you can eat, all you can drink night. Every night it's like $40, and I can't drop $40 every night. But on a positive note, the theories still did prove true. A lot of the tricks I have from meeting people in a foreign country still worked. I met and I had a couple of really amazing friends I met even in Kyoto. I mean, to this day, I talk to them every day. It was just that the overall experience sort of, with the financial difficulties and just the drastic change in environment, I think that was the shocker that really sent things, a different direction.
Right. So would you call that a top tip? Every week I try to find a top tip, and I think this week it might be, if you want to really learn a language and really immerse yourself, try to get away from the I think some people call it the expat bubble, where you are in an area or an environment full of foreigners in the country. Maybe try to find a more natural environment for the country.
Yeah, and there are lots of great ways to do that. My favorite tip for meeting for meeting native speakers when you go to the country, right, is actually asking for help. I mean, and it sounds simple, but I'm telling you, I met so many people that they had been there for 6, 7, 8, 9 months, and they still hadn't hardly ever interacted with a Japanese person.
Right.
We had a survey in my class where the teacher asked, how many of you guys have Japanese friends? And all my classmates were Chinese and Korean, except for, I think, one other. And only me and one other girl actually raised their hand. No one else had Japanese friends. And a lot of them have been there for a year. And so this is why I say it sounds obvious, but apparently it's not. Is asking for help. One of my best friends I met in Japan, actually, in Kyoto. I met because I knew how to use the copy machine. But I saw her there and I thought, So I just asked her, excuse me, how do you use the copy machine? I'm so stuck. I made a few jokes. And because you're a foreigner, and if you speak the language well, it's so exotic to them. They're just fascinated. And it just starts a conversation. In Fukuoka, I got such a boost to my Japanese after the first week because I got lost 1,000 times, sometimes on purpose. And so I was constantly asking for directions. Right. So I was constantly having the same conversations over and over again. So it really boosted my incredible Japanese. So that's one of my top tips.
I would call that the week's top tip then, ask for help.
I hope so. Yeah, do it. And even if you don't need it, ask for help.
Yeah.
Most people are glad to help you. And like I said, it's a great technique for building a sort of your command of the language, because I do think that the fluency is kind of a separate skill in itself. I think, you can be very, very fluent at speaking with a small vocabulary, which isn't necessarily good, but you can come across as very well spoken if you have a practiced sort of set of topics and vocabulary. Or you can know tons and tons of vocab, like you've mentioned on previous episodes, and still struggle to order a coffee. So it's a great way of developing that sort of fluency skill and that command of the language.
The daily speaking.
Yeah. And once again, having those same sort of conversations over and over again, because you're asking the same questions, and then you have the same, where are you from? Oh, I'm from England.
Right.
So I actually got to where I actually had to slow down, because I had told people that I was from England, and I had been living in the States for 5 years so many times that I started to say it so quickly that even native speakers weren't picking me up. Because I had said it so many times, So yeah, it's an excellent way of giving yourself that confidence.
I've noticed that. I don't know if you know a guy named Moses McCormick. He does these. I do, yeah. Okay, good. He does these point of view things where he's out in the field talking to native speakers. And one thing I've noticed is that, I mean, it's a small thing, but it seems like people from Asia and speaking, Chinese, Japanese, and all these languages, they're much more excited about when somebody knows their language than European languages. Seems like, if you meet let's just say a French person in France and you try to speak the language, they're like, oh, you speak my language. I mean, obviously that's a bit of a stereotype, but in Europe, it just seems like, oh, okay, you learned my language, a good thing. But but when you see those Japanese people in Moses' video, they just light up when he starts speaking Japanese to them. And is that something you found as well?
I would agree, yeah, for sure. Because of course, obviously, the main reason would be just it's so rare, and you will find that, especially with Japanese people, and I would imagine other sort of people from the Asian continent, that there's that initial, even if you just say anything, konnichiwa, they're gonna be like, oh my god, you speak Japanese so well, But you do notice a couple of different steps where it starts to go from them just being like, oh my god, to where they're actually like where they almost fall over, like I had it. And Japanese people are so funny in that way because they're so expressive in certain ways when they get surprised and they make these funny sounds. And I had a few people that literally almost like fell over on the ground because they just would, and they were just like, how did you, So yeah, it's a lovely feeling. It's very nice. And that's actually how I got my job in the cafe. I just went over to the manager and just started chatting to her, and she was just all sort of surprised. And so I was like, are you hiring? She was, like, well, we are, but I was like, oh, because I'm a foreigner. She was like, well, technically you could, but she was just really sort of discombobulated. And so I just kind of kept on chatting to her. Next thing you know, I didn't have the job because in Japan, that is a very interesting thing, getting a job. But I at least started the process.
Right. So. Well, fantastic. Maybe maybe we should just take a step back and ask, how did you get involved with Japanese, particularly all the way in the beginning? Where did it come from?
To be very honest with you, I actually, and the funny thing is, the reason why I have an old version of my show, right, and that it was terrible, but I kept a couple episodes on there, and one of them is the old episode 2, where I actually made a goal board, and it was right when I started learning Japanese, and I sat there saying, I've decided to learn Japanese, but I might do Chinese, but I think Japanese. And I talked about how one day I'm going to go study abroad. It's quite funny to watch. But when I chose Japanese, I actually simply just wanted something a little bit more difficult than Spanish. Right. So it was just that I really enjoyed Spanish, and I wasn't even that good at it really. My Spanish, my vocabulary was actually very limited. My listening was quite terrible actually. But I had for some reason, I was very quick and very sort of good at speaking with what I had, so I was able to really have some fun times just despite my actual low overall level. And so I find it quite easy though to sort of integrate. I also, my appearance, especially when I get a bit of a tan, people ask me, am I Italian, am I Spanish, am I Mexican? So it was easy to blend in. So I decided I wanted something, like a bit more of a challenge. So that was, I just went, I debated over Chinese or Japanese for quite some time. And funny enough, I saw a video blog from a Japanese guy out of the blue, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. Right. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And it turns out that I really I thought I had an idea about Japanese culture, but I did not,
Right. You need to experience a foreign culture too.
And that is the beauty of it. And I think that's what gets people addicted, for lack of a better word for now, where to this experience is because when you walk into it expecting one thing, and you end up head first into the deep end of this unbelievable new world. It's such an invigorating experience. And I think that's if people get to that point, that's when they're kind of hooked, and that's what I think a lot of us sort of language enthusiasts really live for, is that sort of, and that's why learning multiple languages is so much fun, because you get to experience it over and over and over.
And different types.
Yes, exactly.
That's really good. And so we already talked about, how you socialized or the lack of, but where do you find the motivation to learn more and new languages? Is it the people like you alluded to in your show, or do you have any other kind of underlying motivational factors that we haven't really touched on?
It really is, actually. It is very much about the people. And the way that I learn language, and the way I add languages, I should say, since that was I think more of your question as well, is I believe it's perfectly fine to study multiple languages simultaneously, or even rather interchangeably. Mm-hmm. But I believe as long as you have control over your sort of lust, and secondly, if you just follow what you're motivated to do, because of course a big issue in language learning is motivation. And so basically, to answer your question, I suppose, I just get inspired. I get exposure, so I'll be exposed to, Hindi was a good one when I started learning Hindi, which I haven't really done very well at so far, but it was because I love Indian food, and I was going to an Indian restaurant a lot here, a little cafe, and it was just, for me, it was like, what an opportunity. Right. How could I come to this place so often and not even start? So I did. And it was, my motivation for that was because I wanted to order my food in Hindi, and I wanted to gradually gain an understanding so that one day down the road, I could actually pursue it. And same thing. So it's different for every language. It's just that I get exposure to one, and I just love it. And so that's why I have to be careful nowadays, because I get exposure to a new one and I get excited, and I have to say, no more right now. So.
Yeah, you kind of have to restrict yourself in a way, because exactly. I mean, some people are different, but I feel like it's a bit of a waste to learn the very basics of, say, 20, 30 languages compared to learning maybe a handful, 10 languages because going from, the basics to some kind of fluency, maybe just a limited fluency, that's not really the biggest leap. But if you keep changing the language, then you're never going to make that leap.
Exactly. Yeah. And I, so for me, it's like, then the way I learn, so because of this way that I do it, and also want just to really quickly conclude that question that you had, is that in regards to my motivation, I do a lot of dreaming, daydreaming, I should say. And so I think that's incredibly important. I do also think it's important. The first step, I think, in any endeavor is you need to have point A, which is where you are now, and point B, which is where you want to be. And I learned that from Luca Toma, who never who that is, but he's a great guy. And he was telling me this. And so it's very important to have that, because I think a lot of people just kind of go into things just without a real sort of goal. And there is a valid point people make, which is, well, if you just look at point B, it's like a mountain and you're going to freak out. So this is why, but the first step though for me is to identify where you actually want to be, and for me, that is such a huge motivational factor. I mean, for me with my, with the Japanese, I mean, that Japanese language literally got me through college, I think, because of, and I don't want to go into but I had the homeless thing, and then I had my, my illness with the hospital and other thing. I mean, there was so many things that were going on, and but that goal that I had of going to Japan, visualizing that end goal, me being there, talking to people, making jokes, making Japanese people laugh, and seeing the faces, that it's unbelievable. That gave me just like a ferocious level of motivation that just never died down. And so, I think it's important to then break it down and say, okay, now here are my more realistic steps. The way I motivate myself to stay with languages is that sort of end huge, that dream. And I daydream a lot, because the more I do it, the more real it gets. And that,
Amazing. So. And of course, I totally agree with the you need to have a vision. But you shouldn't work day to day with that vision. You shouldn't say, I want to write a book. That's not your goal, really. Of course, that's your vision, but every day your goal is, let me write 500 words or 200 words, whatever you feel comfortable with. You have to break it down into steps. I think that's the kind of the general wisdom on the area, where some people are just like, I want to learn Spanish, Italian, and Chinese, and it's like, well, what about if you just said, I want to learn one language, and then said, I want to learn 10 words a day, and I want to read 50 words a day. Break it down into manageable chunks.
Exactly. And I think that's why I never understand these posts I see on forums, and I apologize if any listeners have done this, but the post where it's like, hey guys, I want to learn a new language, what should I do? Right. And it's just like, because there's no connection then. And although I suppose it could work, because if someone makes a suggestion, you might look into it and then make a discovery. But so there is some merit to it, but I think that before you really get started, you need to explore it, and you need to find a connection with it that's going to keep you, because otherwise there's not going to be, like you said, if you're just racking up languages, I just want to learn 10 languages and so I can show off. Right. Because that really isn't. And that's why in my video, I tried to make it very clear that it was 10 languages I went through in the video, but I tried to make it very clear that like half of those were just like the basics, just like, and so it's not to show off. It's just because that's where my motivation carries me. And then I have to limit that. So yeah, I do agree. It's if you just say, oh, I'm going to learn, French, Spanish, German, Italian, whatever. Yeah, I don't know. It's really
you need
to break it down. It is. And then even with that one language, you need to break it down. So that's why my language learning process is sort of in phases. And so each phase is my next realistic step, So it's like you said, it's important to have that big end goal, and it's important to work with that and develop it. But it's also important to work with those much smaller realistic goals.
And I totally agree with the posts on the Facebook. I mean, some of them are just, again, if somebody's listening to this and done the post, I'm sorry, but you can't ask anyone else what language you want to learn. You can get objective input as to, is it a good idea to learn this or that, or if I'm learning Chinese for the first time, should I learn Mandarin or Cantonese or a dialect?
Yeah, precisely.
That's a good question to ask. But asking, should I learn Russian, Spanish, Italian, German, or French first? It's just such a problematic question, and sadly, a lot of people. I think maybe people are getting a little bit. They see videos like Benny Lewis or even Moses. They speak so many languages that people just assume that, well, if I want to speak 10 languages, I better start with 5, right? Or
exactly. and Anthony Lauder had a fantastic presentation at the last Polyglot conference, and he made a good point where, well, I'm not sure he said it quite in this way, but it's the whole idea of, well, you add one,
right?
So you start with how do you speak 2 languages? Well, you start with 1 and you add 1, right. Etc. It's not you don't just start with 9 as a goal.
Yeah, how do I learn 10 languages? Well, you learn 9 and you add 1.
Exactly, and go babackwards. He's a funny guy. I love it.
He's really funny.
I love the way he does his presentations. But exactly, so it's just another top. I guess a top tip for people like that do have that issue is, rather than, I don't know, I mean, there is some merit to it, but I would just find some TV series, experiment, dabble around, and just watch a German show, watch a French show, watch a Japanese movie. I don't know, and then just see if something spark, because there will be a spark if you, and that will carry you.
Yeah, I think so. Or maybe your grandmother's half German and she speaks it a little bit, or maybe there's some kind of heritage somewhere that could make it very interesting for you. But just learning a language randomly, and I mean, I guess that's what you kind of did for Japanese, but I don't think there's a problem in picking one kind of out of the blue that you kind of feel like is good for you, because it's not a commitment. You don't have to. If you decide after a month, okay, the culture, I can't identify with this, I don't like the literature, if you don't like any of it, just switch. There's no, it's not a contract or anything.
And I'll be honest with you, actually, I have had language, quote unquote, they're not really failures, but I'll just, I've had languages I've started and I just couldn't continue it. It just, I didn't have it, and one was, the biggest one was Chinese, actually. It was Mandarin, I should say, because, and it was because the reasons weren't correct. It was, I did it because all my classmates were Chinese. I was hearing Chinese all the time. Because of course the way it works usually, well, the upper levels of these courses are usually always full of either Chinese or Koreans predominantly,
right?
And so I was just like, wow, this is a great opportunity. I could learn this, I could do well.
Exactly.
There's tons of Chinese students at my home university, but I just found that wasn't enough for me. Because I didn't have a real connection with and it's not to say I wouldn't in the future, and so I just couldn't force myself to do that,
right. So that's fine. I don't see anything as failures either, because it's
exactly, that's why I hate that word, but it was just, I've heard people ask a lot online about people's language failures, and so that right. Which I once again, I don't think it's a very good way to put it, but
I think if you went to high elementary school and you had a foreign language, then I think probably 99% of students fail the language, because you just don't learn enough to speak it. So,
and me being a great, like I said, that French absolutely whipped me when I was.
Well, I had the same with French. I literally quit the class, and it was kind of an elective, but I had been studying French for probably a year and a half, just in class, of course. I never studied it outside of school because I just had no real interest in it. But a year and a half later, and I was so hopeless that I decided to just quit. I wouldn't even want to take those 2 weekly classes and just sit there and, just listen some passively. Or I just decided that it was more it was better spent my time to go to, the gaming cafe or whatever we did back in the day. But it's definitely,
and that's great motivation too, because like I look back and I just think, oh my God, like what an idiot, for me, thinking about me. Like I even had a chance to study abroad in France one time. My dad even said he would pay for it. These were the days when when it was as easy as saying like, hey dad, I got a letter from school. They say I can go to France for £200 and for like a whole week, 2 weeks. And I didn't do it. I mean, but now I look back thinking, what an idiot. But at the same time, those are the things that drive me to do better now,
Of course, yeah.
The fact that I went to France so many times with my father and could learn a word of French, I made a decision that next time I go to France, I want to be very proficient in French.
Yeah.
And I love it. I'm loving it.
Powerful,
And so once again, each language, and this is why I told the stories, and I think everyone's got these stories. Each language I'm learning has a different story behind it, and that's the way it should be. It shouldn't just be, I shouldn't say, across the board, but for me, it shouldn't just be every language has the same reason, which is I wanted to add one.
Right. You shouldn't pull one from the hat and just go with that one.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about the technical aspects of your language learning, but before we do that, I just want to round off the documentary and the life feeling. Mm-hmm. There was one question I had where you were shown, you said you were in Japan and you were having a rough time, and then you said you started studying languages for 8 to 10 hours a day, like every living moment. Can you maybe explain the feeling behind? What is a defensive reaction to how you were feeling, or was it an inspirational moment, I guess, is my question.
Actually, it was a escape. It was that loneliness can do some really severe things to you. Anyone that's been lonely knows that. We've all experienced that, I think, to some degree. But I got into the point where my finances were just so poor. I was eating once a day for a while and this kind of stuff. I mean, so it was the more sort of bad, the worse it got, the more I just was isolated. And then I started to, anyway, so the point was that I couldn't focus on actually Japanese. It was this very odd feeling where I hated the classes. Like, I mean, I just thought it was useless. I mean, it was, I feel bad because I shouldn't, I hate to down a system or talk. I don't like to talk negatively about things, but, I just found that I was learning so much more with my own methods, and I was just progressing so quickly, but the schoolwork was holding me back, and it got to where I just couldn't stand it. The methodology was just so useless to me. And I spent a lot of time in Japan researching polyglots, for example, researching like, okay, how are these guys doing? Right. And so what happened was that studying these other languages was a way for me to escape what was going on around me. It was a way for me to escape that loneliness. Right. Because when I'm studying, for some reason, when I can, even at times, like when I just can't do anything else, I can almost always find motivation to study foreign language. I just love it that much. And so because I was speaking Japanese all the time, every day, I was working in Japanese, all my classes were in Japanese. When I came home, I wanted something else. And so I picked up I started French again, and I just fell in love with it. And then I got curious, and I started Norwegian actually. And I loved, I don't know why, I just loved Norwegian. It was so much fun to me.
I don't know, man. Danish is better.
I debated. But I promise I do plan to go to Danish eventually, absolutely. But it was just that it just grew and grew and grew. Yeah, so, like I said, the 8 to 10 hours a day part, it was just that. I came home and I just loved, that was my escape. And I just loved the feeling of progress. I love knowing that what I'm doing. And the funny thing is, I didn't even just do that. When I study languages, I like primitive living skills. I have so many other hobbies. I'll often be like making string out of like plants and stuff while I'm studying languages because I find it fun. So I love that feeling of just, knowing that I'm doing something productive. Yeah. And so, once again, when you study that much, and I did the same for Japanese, actually, it wasn't any different. It was just about 9 hours a day, probably an average for Japanese. The the improvement is exponential that you see such a huge improvement every day that is almost its own motive, because it is truth. I mean, it's even laws of fit. I mean, it's easier. The faster you go, the easier it is to go faster.
Right.
Just like a plane accelerating from 0 to 60, it's going to be much faster to go from 60 to 80 and etc. So, what I mean? So the more momentum you build,
right.
And so I just ended up on this massive mountain of just sort of snowballing momentum, and it was an interesting time.
Right. I mean, of course, it has to be said that it does sound a little bit like maybe an unhealthy obsession, if you had to be totally honest. I mean, it's nice to have the passion and the drive to do it for so long, but I mean, you must have neglected some basic human kind of natural instincts. Maybe socialize. You didn't socialize as much at that time, and you said you weren't eating, properly. And is that the kind of the price to pay when you're that into it?
I think so. I mean, and in this case, it was a bit backwards, actually. It was more that I didn't have the money to eat more than certain times a day. So it was more a way to keep my mind off of that. But I will say, when I was doing Japanese, though, that is exactly what you're talking about. Because, and that's what I mentioned in the video, my drive for Japanese and the amount of time I put into it really did. I had to sacrifice a lot. I sacrificed a lot of good times and probably friendships that I could have made and that could have grown and these things. And that was one of my definitely a regret about that. So you're absolutely correct. I mean, it was a goal I had and I wanted it bad, and so once again, it's really what I mentioned in the video a lot is that I realized that, a lot of my life I had spent, first it was basketball, then it was Japanese. And it's not worth it. Really, even if you do achieve the end goal, if you end up alone, if you end up standing alone and you have no one really to share those memories with, the failures, the successes, the ups and downs, it's just not worth it.
Yeah, and speed is one of the other things that constantly keeps mentioned. It's like, how can I learn this the fastest? And
I hate that.
for you, that would probably be your answer would probably be, well, spend 10 hours a day doing it. But I think it's way better to just take a very casual approach and say, well, do I have an hour in the evening or an hour in the morning or whatever? Learn the language in a year and a half or whatever it takes you. Don't be pressured by these, hype about be fluent in 6 weeks in your sleep or something.
Yeah. And actually my old answer would have been what you said, but now I would not tell anybody to do it for that. Unless they want to, I mean, but that would not be my answer to the quickest way to doing things. I don't think that it's like you said, it's not really, not necessarily healthy unless you're getting paid for it. Like Steve Kaufman often mentions how he was getting paid to learn Chinese that amount of time, so it's kind of different. But now that would not be the way. My methods have changed so much.
Hello guys, this is Chris Bro. Just want to thank you for listening to this first part of this 2-part series with Robin MacPherson. We got into a lot of detail here about general language learning cultures and also about psychological and emotional factors when we embrace new cultures and languages. Next week, you're going to hear from Robin about just exactly how he learns languages and what he's learned in his aspirations towards learning all these fancy new languages. And if it's later than May 16th, then the episode will have already gone live and you can just jump straight into episode 10. This is episode 9. And of course, all the resources and links will be in actualfluency.com/09. So thank you again for listening and I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast. For more information, be sure to check out actualfluency.com. Until next time, enjoy learning and have a great day.